All you lovely people, I hope you indulge in a little lower pleasure of at least a snack. Professor Gray, I did, of course, I did. Well, so let's go back now to some higher pleasures of learning more about John Stuart Mill's deliberative utilitarianism. And so far, I've explained the first major difference between John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. Yes, Bentham was a hedonist where all pleasures were equal. All that mattered was the amount or the quantity of pleasure. But Mill, we saw, accepts a notion of eudaimonism, which says that well-being is nothing other than happiness, understood as the pleasure that comes from the cultivation and exercise of those higher order capacities distinguishing human beings from other animals. So yeah, Mill does not think all pleasures are equal. Mill is concerned with far more than the mere quantity of pleasure. So indeed, the quality of pleasure is important. All pleasures are not equal. There will be higher pleasures, there will be lower pleasures. We care about the quality before we care about the quantity. And again, those better pleasures come from the development and exercise of our higher order faculties as humans. And again, the lower pleasures, important, but aren't as important. The higher ones are important. And so now I'd like to talk in this video just about how we might model this decision-making. Mill isn't quite as clear because this is a more complicated view than we get from Bentham. Bentham, it's all math, easy peasy. Here it's going to be, as you can tell, as we're going to see as we go forward, a little more complicated. But as always, don't let Professor Gray's fancy pants language make you nervous. I will get you through this. It's not as complicated often as it seems. I just use fancy pants language so I'm precise. But for you guys, we're friends now. I will do my best to make it understandable. Okay, so what I'm going to call now this part of Mill's view, I will call the pluralistic total view. The pluralistic total view, which has three parts: quantitative pluralism, vector sum ranking, and lexical priority. Understanding these three things will complete our picture of Mill's deliberative utilitarianism. And to illustrate how it works, I want to go back to that remember that example about celebrating your birthday we did a few modules ago? Yeah, so as we did with that example, recall that classical utilitarianism looked at the choices for dinner and decided you're going to get Chinese food because Chinese food was going to produce the greatest overall pleasure. That was classical utilitarianism, picking Chinese food. You might not have liked it, but your family on the whole did, so that's what you should have done as a classical utilitarianism. Well, now let's suppose you've had a nice dinner at the Chinese restaurant. Mom and dad want to go back home and go to bed because they're old, but you and your brother and sister want to hang out and do something together. So this is you, your brother, and your sister. If you don't have those, well, now you do. It's a boy and a girl. Anyway, so there's going to be some kind of after dinner activity. And let's suppose the options for the activities is a choice between a poetry reading or an action movie. So you can go to a poetry reading or you can watch an action movie with your brother and sister. Now, according to deliberative utilitarianism, you should look at the pleasures produced by each of these activities, being careful, of course, to give importance to the higher pleasures. And the pluralist total view will help us figure all that out. So the first part of the pluralistic view of here, the pluralistic total view, there we go. The first is quantitative pluralism. It says that individual well-being is measured numerically and specifically by a vector of numerical quantities. This vector may be called a vector of plural utilities. Some utilities in this vector have priority over others. That is, there are some utilities that are more valuable than other utilities. Holy cow, Professor Gray is using some fancy pants language. Now, yes, math people, I am using those words in the way that you use them. Yes, vector means vector as it does in math. Non-math people, don't you worry. I got you covered. I will just talk about plural utilities, and I'll make sure we all understand what that means. And especially once I go through this example, I think you'll have a sense of what we're talking about when I'm talking about plural utilities. I just like fancy language because I do like to be precise, at least for the math people. So let's, again, though, this basic idea of quantitative pluralism. Pluralism meaning many. Quantitative, meaning numbers. So again, we're using many numbers to measure and assess well-being, to assess happiness, to assess pleasure. And those many numbers involved will be the plural utilities. So we won't have just one utility value. We'll have several. And I'll walk you through all that. So this means now, again, we're choosing between the poetry reading and the action movie. Well, we would look at the poetry reading and say, how much higher pleasure does it give you? How much intermediate or medium pleasure give you? How much lower pleasure does it give you? Now, here I'm only using 3 types of pleasure, high pleasure, medium pleasure, low pleasure. Of course, though, maybe there's even more levels of pleasure, like medium low or medium high or medium, very, I don't know, whatever. There can be lots of options. I'm just doing 3 to keep it, at least to give you a sense of what's going on, but not trying to go too crazy. Now, quantitative pluralism says that these different kinds of pleasure will be represented by plural utilities. That is, by multiple numbers. And in this case, let's look here. In this case, it seems that you get a higher pleasure utility, the high, HI, of 10 for poetry, maybe because poetry really gets your mind going and imagination working. It has a medium pleasure utility of 4. Maybe that medium pleasure comes from, spending time with your brother and sister and maybe talking about the poetry. And it has a lower pleasure utility of 2. Maybe they don't serve food or alcohol at the poetry reading, so not a lot of lower pleasure there. But again, a lot of higher pleasure. So those, there you go, there they are. Those are your plural utilities for the poetry reading, 10, 4, 2. That's your plural utilities. Again, those are multiple numbers, 10, 4, and 2, where 10 is the amount of higher pleasure, 4 is the amount of medium pleasure, and 2 is the amount of lower pleasure. And of course, now you do the exact same thing for the action movie to determine the plural utility for it. And now it's a pretty dumb action movie, let's assume, so not much higher faculties are being used there, but you'll get to spend time with your brother and your sister, and you like the popcorn you'll get to eat during the movie. And so in this case, you can see here from the numbers that you like the poetry reading a lot because it gives you a lot of higher pleasure. Maybe you're an English major or you've read a lot of poetry. And so, yeah, you really want to go to that poetry meeting. It sounds like it's really going to exercise your mind and your imagination. Whereas the action movie, you'll get pleasure from it, but it won't be as much because it's kind of a brainless, film. But of course, utilitarianism, as always, says that you can't decide just based on what makes you happy. You got to consider your family. So your brother and sister in this case. So we got to consider their happiness. And now it turns out that your brother and sister really want to see the action movie because they think poetry is pretty boring. And so you can see here from what I've just shown you on that chart that they get a lot of lower pleasure from that movie. Not a lot of pleasure coming from the poetry. But we still do need to consider the other pleasures that they get. So it's not just about the lower pleasures. We have to look at the medium and the high pleasures so we can put those into the picture. And as you can see, your brother and your sister don't get a lot of higher pleasure from the poetry. Perhaps, again, you've studied poetry, so you really do have the developed capacity to really get some good pleasure from it. But maybe your brother and your sister, just have never read poetry, never studied it, and so they don't have the higher capacity to appreciate it. In any case, as you can see here, it seems that you're the only person in the family who likes the poetry reading. Everyone else seems to be getting more utility or more total pleasure from the action movie. And indeed, if Jeremy Bentham or any kind of classical utilitarian looked at this chart, they'd say, oh yeah, go to the action movie, do the math. I'll wait. But if you do the math, it's pretty clear that the numbers are getting much higher for the action movie than the poetry. But that's not what deliberative utilitarianism says. Remember, not all pleasures are equal. We're going to give preference to the higher ones. Because again, Mill says the higher pleasures are more important. So yeah, we have to think about this. So yeah, there might be more lower pleasure, but the decision needs to be based on showing preference for our higher faculties and our higher pleasures. And so if we go back to the pluralistic total view, we can now look at the second part, which is vector sum ranking, which says that the overall, so we've done the individuals, now we got to do the group. The overall well-being is the vector of aggregate utility for the group. As usual, you're probably thinking, okay, smarty pants, you better walk me through this vector of aggregate. Okay, math people will know what I'm talking about. Non-math people, don't worry, I got your backs. So let's break down vector sum ranking into 2 claims. 1, each person in the group has an individual vector of plural utilities associated with their own personal well-being. And number 2, the vector of aggregate utility for the group is calculated by summing up these individual vectors of plural utilities. That probably isn't helping you at all, is it? Don't worry, we'll walk you through through the example. I mean, I will say the first part is just repeating what has already been shown in the table. Put the table back up there. You can see, how we're measuring the plural utility for each individual for each option. So I have a plural utility for the movie and plural utility for the poetry and so on. And so again, that's for each individual involved. So each individual has their own plural utilities for each of the options. And so we see that in the table. But now the second part of vector sum ranking is about how do we get it for the group. And so we can create a similar set of plural utilities for the options, for the group. So for the two activities, we sum up the higher pleasures for each. Here we see that the poetry reading has a total higher pleasures of 13 for the group. That's just adding it up. You have 10 and your siblings have 2 and 3. And so that gives us a total of 13. And then we do the exact same thing for the action movie, which has a utility for the higher pleasures of 3 for the group. And that's just, again, adding up your utility of 1 for the movie plus your higher pleasures of 0 and 2 for your siblings. Again, that's a total of 3. So it's 13 versus 3 when it comes to the higher pleasures. But of course, we will repeat the same exact process so we repeat that again by summing up the total amount of medium pleasure for each activity, and then repeat that yet again one last time by summing up the total amount of lower pleasure for each of those two activities. And so once again, now we have the group's plural utilities for each option. For instance, the group's plural utilities for the poetry reading are 13, 12, and 3. 13, 12, 3. That's the plural utilities for poetry, where 13 is the total amount of higher pleasure for the group, 12 is the total amount of medium pleasure for the group, and 3 is the total amount of lower pleasure for the group. All right. Well, how do we decide which one to pick? I mean, again, Jeremy Bentham would just look at this and say, why are we doing this? Just pick the one with the most. It was pretty clear which one had the most. So yeah, Jeremy Bentham's annoyed with us. He just says, pick the movie already. It's clearly got the higher numbers overall. So go with that. Skip the boring poetry. However, that's not what Mill says, as we know. Look at page 187. On page 187, we see Mill says, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality, so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison of small account. What is Mill saying here? Mill is just saying that the higher, superior pleasures are way more valuable because of their quality. Their superior quality makes them better. No matter how much quantity of a lower pleasure is involved, it doesn't matter. The higher one wins because it's more important. So no matter how much lower, inferior pleasure is involved, we look to the higher ones when we should act. So we should choose the activity, Mill says, the one that has the greater amount of higher pleasure. And indeed, this is expressed by the third and final part of the pluralistic total view, that is lexical priority, which says optimize according to the highest level, most valuable utilities in the vector of plural utilities. If there are ties, then optimize according to the second highest level, the second most valuable utilities to break those ties. If there are still ties, optimize according to the third highest, and so on. Apart from breaking ties, no lower level, less valuable utilities may outweigh or override higher level ones. If you're a math student, well done, yes, this is lexical ordering that you see. It's a pretty standard idea in advanced math and in abstract algebra, whatever. I forget where, actually. I know I studied it in a math class, maybe discrete math. I forget, long time ago. But if you're not a math student, hey, no worries. I got you. Professor Gray got you. I can tell you what this means in normal language. It's actually, I just want the math people to feel included in a philosophy class. But let's go back to the birthday example. We want the activity that produces the most higher pleasure. That's what's going to produce the greatest happiness. We start with the higher pleasures first. So we look only at the higher pleasures. And since the poetry reading produces the most higher pleasure, that is the activity we pick. You finally get to do what you want, because what you want involves higher pleasure. And now notice, yes, the movie produces a ton of lower pleasure. But again, Mill says that those lower quality pleasures are of, what does he say, like a small or lesser account. They do not matter. It's the higher pleasures that guide us. So now if you just look back, I'll throw it back up there. That's the main idea, what we see here from lexical priority. The fancy language is really just telling us what to do if there's a tie. That is, yeah, if two choices or two options produce the same amount of that higher pleasure, then you can go to the next low, the next second highest. You can start going down the pleasures to try to break that tie. I just included the fancy definition to be complete. And so again, we want the math people to feel included now and then. Yeah, math people, I've given you vectors. I've given you lexical priority. May you go forth and be smart. I don't know. But for the rest of us, by the way, you've learned a little math and you don't even know it. That's pretty cool. But along, I just want you to get the important point I want everyone to get, math and non-math people, is that we're choosing based on the higher pleasures. We start there. We only start going down to the lower pleasures when there are ties. So quality comes first, and then we can go down. I hope that makes sense. If not, tweet me. Oh my God, that's another one. It's another video. I know there's so much here. It's wild, but you are learning no small thing, my friends. You're my friends now, I guess, for some reason. Now you know all the different parts of deliberative utilitarianism. There's the list. There they all are. You are. Now you can start to see. Yeah, let's throw up this other one here. You can see Mill is very different from Bentham. Yes, they agree on consequentialism and welfarism, but when it comes to happiness, once you get hedonism replaced by this eudaimonism, things get very different very quickly. All right, look, I still have, yes, one more video. You guys, you're rock stars. But I have to do this last video to address the most common kind of issue that people have about Mill. Namely, they say, hey, Mr. Mill, this is like your brother and sister. Your brother and sister are like, hey, Mr. Mill, who are you to say that poetry is better than the movie? I love the movie, this action film. How can you say, Mr. Mill, what counts as a higher pleasure or what counts as a lower pleasure? And I think that is a very valid concern. And yeah, people disagree about that. So Mill has to have an answer or at least a response. And so take one more quick break, maybe a longer break if you want. That's fine. I'm cool with it. Of course I am. Who am I to stop you? I'm going crazy. Oh, I'm talking to myself, but talking to you while talking to myself. That's kind of cool. What was I saying? Go take a break and we'll come back and I'll explain again how Mill deals with how he can justify what counts as a higher pleasure versus what counts as a lower pleasure. All right. Take your break. I'll see you back here in a moment.